The will was 2 pages long, and it took the attorney 11 minutes to read it. When he finished, James Collar was 31 years old, and he owned a broken Massey Ferguson 590, 420 acres of corn and soybean ground in Warren County, Indiana, and $14,200 in outstanding debt split across 3 creditors. Equipment note with 6 payments remaining, a land improvement loan that had been taken out to tile a field in 1989, and a balance on a parts account at the co-op that his father had been paying down $20 at a time since 1991. His father Harold had died in March of 1993, a Wednesday morning, of a stroke that came without warning while he was doing the preseason inspection on the Massey Ferguson. Harold had been 64 years old. He had been farming since 1957. He had farmed the way men of his generation farmed when they had modest ground and modest means, and no particular belief that either condition was going to change dramatically, carefully, without waste, with the specific discipline of someone who understood that the margin between a farm that works and a farm that doesn't is thinner than it looks from outside. He had not been a successful farmer in any sense that the agricultural press of the 1970s and 1980s would have recognized. He had not expanded aggressively. He had not leveraged land appreciation to finance equipment. He had not grown beyond what his labor and his cash flow could honestly support. He had farmed 420 acres with aging equipment and made his payments and maintained his fences and kept his books in a ledger on the kitchen shelf, and died with $14,000 in debt, which in 1993 was not a catastrophe, but was also not nothing. James sat in the attorney's office and looked at the 2 pages of the will and the summary of the estate that the attorney had prepared, and understood that what his father had left him was not wealth. It was not debt either, not in the way that debt becomes a crisis. It was a situation with a broken tractor and 400 acres and $14,000 owed to 3 people, and no particular instruction for how to proceed. His father had not left a note. Harold Collar was not a man who left notes. He was a man who left a tractor that needed work in a shed and ground that needed farming, and the expectation unspoken, because everything important to Harold was unspoken, that the person inheriting the situation would figure out what the situation required. James drove home from the attorney's office and went directly to the equipment shed and opened the hood of the Massey Ferguson 590. The 590 had been Harold's tractor since 1978, bought used at a farm sale for $6,000 when it had 4,000 hours on it. By March of 1993, it had 11,800 hours. It had been Harold's primary machine for 15 years, planting, tillage, harvest support, whatever the season required. It had been maintained the way Harold maintained everything, which was to say consistently and without excess. Oil changed on schedule, filters replaced when the hours said to replace them, nothing deferred that couldn't be deferred safely, and nothing upgraded that didn't need upgrading. What had failed was the injection pump. Harold had been in the middle of the preseason inspection. James reconstructed this later from the position of the tools on the workbench and the state of the engine when the stroke had taken him. The injection pump had been on his list that morning. He had the rebuild kit on the workbench, still in its package. He had not opened it. James opened it. He spent the afternoon reading the service manual section on injection pump service. He had done this kind of work before, alongside his father, but not alone, and not with the specific pressure of knowing that the tractor needed to be in the field in 3 weeks, and he was the only person who was going to put it there. He rebuilt the injection pump over 2 days. He followed the service manual precisely, with the focused attention of someone who understands that this is not the moment for improvisation. He reinstalled it on a Friday afternoon. He started the engine. It ran. He sat in the shed with the engine idling and understood, in the specific way that a person understands something when they have done it rather than been told it, that the tractor was his now in a way that it had not been when he inherited it. He had put his own work into it. That was the difference. He went inside and called his mother, who had moved to her sister's house in Crawfordsville after the funeral. He told her the tractor was running. She said Harold would have been pleased. James said he thought so too. He had 3 weeks before planting. He spent them working through the preseason inspection list his father had started, checking everything, noting what needed attention, addressing what he could address, and scheduling what he couldn't. When the ground was ready in mid-April, the Massey Ferguson 590 was ready with it. He planted 420 acres that spring, alone, on a schedule that ran from before sunrise to after dark on the days when the weather cooperated. He finished on May 3rd. The planting was done. The $14,200 in debt was not an emergency. It was a presence, something that had to be accounted for in every decision James made about the operation across the following years, a weight that shaped choices without crushing them. He paid the equipment note first because it was the largest single obligation and because equipment notes carry the specific risk of repossession if they go current. He made the final payment in November of 1993, 7 months after Harold's death, using the proceeds from the fall harvest, combined with a careful reduction of his personal expenses that he did not discuss with anyone because it was not anyone else's business. He paid the land improvement loan through 1994 and 1995 in the way it had been structured, monthly installments that the original loan terms required. The field that the tiling served produced better drainage than the surrounding ground and had been yielding measurably better since 1989. James watched this with the attention of someone who had inherited a decision and was evaluating whether it had been the right one. By 1995, he had concluded it had been. The tiling had been worth the loan. The co-op balance he paid in full in February of 1994, 22 months ahead of the pace Harold had been keeping. He walked into the co-op on a Thursday morning and paid the remaining balance and asked for a receipt and put the receipt in the farm file where he kept financial records. He did not tell anyone he had paid it. But the co-op manager, a man named Walt Sheridan, who had known Harold for 30 years, shook his hand and said, "Your father was a good man." James said he was. Walt said, "I expect you will be too." James said he intended to try. By the spring of 1994, the estate was free of all inherited debt. James Collar was 32 years old, and he owed nothing and had 420 acres and a Massey Ferguson 590 with 12,000 hours on it and the ledger on the kitchen shelf that Harold had kept since 1971, updated now in James's own handwriting. He opened the ledger to a new page. He wrote the date, April 1994, and the balance, 0, and the note, all inherited debt cleared. Then he put the ledger back on the shelf and went out to check the soil temperature in the south field. The years that followed were the years of a farm finding its level under new management. James farmed the way his father had farmed, which was to say carefully, without the expansion ambition that the agricultural press of the 1990s promoted, and without the equipment upgrade cycle that dealer financing made easy and cash flow analysis made dangerous. He maintained the Massey Ferguson 590 the way Harold had maintained it. Oil on schedule, filters when the hours required, nothing deferred that the deferral would cost more than the doing. He added 80 acres in 1997. A neighboring parcel had come available when the family that owned it decided to sell, and the price was right in the way that prices are right when the seller needs to complete the transaction and the buyer has the cash reserve to complete it without financing. James had the cash reserve because he had been building it since 1994 with the specific intention of being able to move when something was priced correctly. He paid for the 80 acres without a loan. Doug Winters bought a new John Deere 8400 that same fall, financed over 6 years. His operation expanded through the late 1990s on borrowed capital, reached 1,400 acres by 2003, and then contracted sharply during the farm credit tightening of 2008 and 2009. By 2011, Doug was farming 900 acres on a payment schedule that required commodity prices to stay within a range the market did not always deliver. He was still farming in 2012, but the margin was thin in a way that James's margin was not, because James's fixed costs did not include debt service, and Doug's did. James did not observe this with satisfaction. He observed it the way he observed everything about his operating environment. As information, relevant to his own decisions, filed in the part of his accounting that tracked the relationship between choices and consequences across years long enough for the relationship to become clear. In 1998, the Massey Ferguson 590 crossed 14,000 hours. James had the engine inspected at a shop in Attica whose mechanic had been working on Massey Ferguson equipment for 22 years. The mechanic pulled the valve cover, checked the rocker arms, looked at the injectors, and said the engine was running cleaner than most machines he saw at half that count. He asked what James had been doing. James said he'd been changing the oil every 100 hours since he inherited the machine in 1993. The mechanic said that explained it. James said his father had done the same for the 15 years before that. The mechanic said, "That's 29 years of correct maintenance. No wonder it's clean." James said, 29 years of my father and 5 of mine. The mechanic said, "Same result either way." James drove home and noted the inspection result in the maintenance log he had started in 1993 and updated at every service interval since. The log had been Harold's before it was his, Harold's handwriting through 1993, James's handwriting after. A continuous record across 2 ownerships and 2 decades of the same machine being maintained the same way by 2 men who approached it the same way without having explicitly discussed the approach. James bought land twice more before 2005, 120 acres in 2001, from an estate that wanted a quick sale, paid in cash. 40 acres in 2004, a corner parcel adjacent to his north field that had been farmed by a neighbor who was scaling back. He paid cash for that too, a smaller transaction that he completed in an afternoon at the attorney's office. By 2005, James Collar was farming 660 acres in Warren County, Indiana. He owned every acre without debt. He had made no equipment loans since paying off the inherited note in 1993. The Massey Ferguson 590 had been supplemented in 1999 with a used Massey Ferguson 3095 that he bought at an estate auction for $11,000, cash, and that had become his primary tractor, the 590 moving into secondary work and loader duty. His operation was not visible in the ways that successful operations are visible. He did not run new equipment, he did not farm the most acres in the county, he did not have the kind of profile that farm magazines feature, the large, modern, expanding operation that represents the direction agricultural economics is supposed to be moving. He had the kind of profile that farm magazines do not feature. A man farming 600 acres of paid-for ground with aging equipment maintained to a standard that kept it reliable, no debt service competing with his operating costs, a cash reserve that let him move when something was priced correctly. In 2006, a banker at First Warren Bank in Attica called James and asked if he would be interested in a meeting to discuss expansion opportunities. The banker said the farm economy was strong, and that interest rates were favorable, and that James's balance sheet was the kind of balance sheet that made expansion financing straightforward. James said he appreciated the call. He said he wasn't interested in expansion financing. The banker said the rates were the best they'd been in 15 years. James said the rates weren't the issue. The banker asked what the issue was. James said, "The issue is that I don't borrow money." The banker said, "Never?" James said, "Not since 1993, and that was inherited." The banker said he'd never heard that from a farmer before. James said he'd never had occasion to say it before. He thanked the banker and hung up. He noted the call in his farm journal, not because it was important, but because he noted everything, and went back to the hydraulic fitting he had been replacing on the 3095 before the phone rang. In 2012, James's son Nathan came back to the farm. Nathan was 24 years old. He had spent 2 years at Purdue studying agricultural economics and 2 more working for a farm management company in Indianapolis before deciding that the managing of other people's farms was less interesting than the farming of his own. He had come back not because the farm needed him. James was managing it correctly and efficiently and alone. But because he wanted to farm, and the farm was there, and it was his family's, and he understood at 24 something that James had understood at 31, that the farm was the thing that mattered, and that the thing that mattered was worth coming back to. James showed Nathan the ledger first, not the equipment, not the fields, not the maintenance logs, the ledger, the one Harold had started in 1971, and James had continued in 1993. 40 years of the farm's financial history in Harold's handwriting and James's, two men's records of the same operation across 2 generations. Nathan looked through it for a long time. He said, "You never borrowed." James said, "Once, 1993, inherited." Nathan said, "And you paid it off the same year." The equipment note, yes. The rest by 1994. Nathan looked at the ledger. He said, "How did you know that was the right approach?" James said, "I looked at what my father left me. He left me good ground and a tractor that worked and $14,000 owed to 3 people. And I paid the $14,000 and kept the ground and maintained the tractor. That was the approach." Nathan said, "And then?" James said, "And then I did it again, every year." "That's it?" James said, "That's all there is." Nathan worked alongside James through the 2012 and 2013 seasons, learning the operation the way James had learned his father's, through proximity, through the work itself, through the specific education of doing things alongside a person who has been doing them correctly for a long time and understands why correct matters. In 2014, James added 80 more acres, bringing his total to 740. He paid cash. In 2016, he added 160 more, the ground adjacent to his south field that had been farmed by a retiring neighbor. He paid cash. The operation reached 900 acres. Nathan was 30 years old in 2018. He had been farming full-time for 6 years. He understood the land, the equipment, and the ledger. He understood the approach, not just the surface of it, the no-debt rule, the cash purchases, the maintained equipment, but the structure underneath it, the reason the approach worked, which was that it removed the dependency on conditions outside the farmer's control. No debt meant no payment schedule. No payment schedule meant no crisis when commodity prices fell, or yields dropped, or weather did what weather does. The farm's survival was not conditional on the market cooperating. It was conditional on the work being done correctly, which was a condition James could meet. In the spring of 2019, James Kohler called his attorney. He was 57 years old. His knees had been telling him for 2 years that the physical demands of full-time farming were approaching what he could sustain, and his own accounting had been telling him, more quietly but with equal clarity, that the operation was ready to pass to the person he had been training to receive it. The transfer took 6 months to structure and execute. James retained ownership of the farmhouse and a small parcel around it. Everything else, 1,120 acres of Warren County ground, the Massey Ferguson equipment fleet, the buildings, the grain storage, transferred to Nathan Kohler in November of 2019. The debt attached to the transfer, 0. Nathan stood in the farm office on the day the transfer was complete and looked at the ledger on the shelf. Harold's handwriting, then James's, now his to continue. He looked at the bottom line of the most recent page. November 2019, 1,120 acres, 0 debt outstanding. He took the ledger down from the shelf and opened it to a new page. He wrote the date. He wrote the balance. He wrote, "Transfer complete, all accounts current." Then he put the ledger back and went out to do the preseason maintenance on the Massey Ferguson 3095, which had been James's primary tractor for 20 years and was now his. The engine had been rebuilt once in 2008. The hydraulic pump had been rebuilt in 2014. The maintenance log showed every service interval from 1999 to the present day. 20 years of James's handwriting, consistent, complete, the record of a machine that had been treated correctly across a long time. Nathan started the engine. It ran clean. He checked the oil. It was at level, clear. He checked the hydraulics, full pressure, no lag. He shut it down and greased the fittings and noted the preseason inspection in the maintenance log in his own handwriting for the first time. He thought about his grandfather Harold, who had bought a Massey Ferguson 590 in 1978 and maintained it for 15 years, and died with a preseason inspection half done on the workbench and $14,000 owed to 3 people. He thought about his father, James, who had rebuilt the injection pump and paid the debts and farmed 400 acres into 1,100 across 26 years without borrowing a dollar. He thought about the ledger on the shelf, 1971 to 2019, 3 men's handwriting, one continuous record of the same farm across 4.5 decades. The Massey Ferguson 590 that Harold bought in 1978 had been retired in 2007 at 16,000 hours. James had sold it to a farmer in Fountain County who had been looking for exactly that model for parts. The engine, original, had never been opened. The farmer had called 2 weeks after the purchase to say it was the cleanest machine he'd seen at that count. James had said he was glad to hear it. He had said his father maintained it for 15 years, and he had maintained it for 14. The farmer said, 29 years of correct maintenance. No wonder. James had said, that's the only kind there is. Nathan closed the maintenance log and put it back on the shelf beside the ledger. Outside, the November ground was going into its winter quiet. The 1,120 acres that Harold Collar could not have imagined, and James Collar had built one careful decision at a time, were waiting for the spring. The debt was 0. The ground was there, the equipment was maintained, the ledger was on the shelf. Everything Harold had intended, done the way Harold would have done it, carried forward by a son who had learned from watching and a grandson who was learning from watching him. The work would continue in the spring. It always did. It always would. The machine had been sitting at the edge of his east field for 14 months before anyone made a decision about it. Not because the decision was complicated, because nobody wanted to be the one to make it. The Massey Ferguson 6S165 had been repossessed from a farmer named Curtis Albright in the spring of 2 years prior, driven to the field boundary by a dealer employee who had run out of road before he ran out of trouble, and left there when the tractor seized completely on the way to the transport truck. The hydraulic system had been failing for months before the repossession. The previous owner had known it and said nothing. The dealer employee had not known it until the machine stopped moving 40 yards inside the field boundary of the adjacent property, which belonged to a 69-year-old retired grain farmer named Harold Ennis, and refused to move further. The dealer employee had called his manager. The manager had called the dealership. The dealership had called a transport company. The transport company had sent a truck that couldn't reach the machine without crossing Harold's property, which Harold had not given permission to cross, because nobody had asked Harold anything. Harold had stood at the fence line that afternoon and watched a dealer employee, a transport driver, and eventually the dealership's service manager stand around a seized Massey Ferguson on the edge of his east field and argue about whose problem it was. Harold had not offered an opinion. He had gone inside when it got dark, and in the morning the machine was still there and the men were gone. That was how it started. Harold Ennis had farmed 1,800 acres of corn and soybeans in Fountain County, Indiana, for 38 years. He had retired 3 years earlier, leasing his ground to a neighbor's operation and keeping his equipment shed, his shop tools, and the 40 acres around the farmhouse for his own use. He was not a man who looked for complications in his retirement. He had a wood stove in the shop, a decent set of hand tools, and a standing Wednesday morning coffee arrangement with 2 men he had known since 1979. He had not planned, at 69, to get into the Massey Ferguson parts business. The legal situation took 7 months to resolve. The dealership held the security interest in the repossessed machine. The machine sat on Harold's property without his consent. The path to recovering it crossed his land without an easement. Harold had not blocked recovery. He had simply declined to grant access until someone asked him properly and agreed to repair the ruts a recovery vehicle would create crossing his east field. The dealership's attorney sent a letter. Harold's attorney responded. A negotiation that should have taken 2 weeks took 7 months because the dealership changed ownership during that period. The new owner reviewed the situation, concluded the machine's recovery cost exceeded its salvage value in its current condition, and quietly decided to let the legal situation drift rather than spend money on a machine they had not bought. By the time title resolved, through a process Harold's attorney navigated with the county and the lien holder with more patience than anyone involved deserved, 14 months had passed. The machine had sat through one full winter, one spring thaw, one summer, and into the following autumn. The hydraulic failure had been compounded by weather. An electrical fault had developed. The cab had taken on moisture. One rear tire had gone flat from a sidewall crack opened by frost. When the title transferred to Harold Ennis, the dealership's formal position was that the machine was being conveyed as is, with no warranty, representation, or expectation of operability. The dealership had written the machine to zero on its books. It was, in every financial sense the dealership could apply, worthless. Harold walked out to the East Field on the morning after the title transfer was confirmed and stood beside the Massey Ferguson 6S.165 for a long time. He was not a Massey Ferguson man by history. He had run Case IH equipment for most of his farming years, switching to a mixed fleet in his last decade of active operation. He knew Massey Ferguson equipment the way any experienced farmer knows competing brands, well enough to operate them, not deeply enough to rebuild them from the inside. What he knew, standing at the edge of his east field on a cold October morning, was that the machine had not become worthless because it was a bad machine. It had become worthless in the dealership's accounting because the cost of making it whole exceeded what the dealership could recover at retail. That was a dealer's calculation. It was not the only calculation available. Harold had a heated shop. He had 40 years of mechanical experience on agricultural equipment, not specialized in Massey Ferguson, but thorough in the ways that matter across brands, for a man who had spent 4 decades keeping machinery running in conditions that do not forgive ignorance. He had time. He had no particular deadline. And he had a piece of equipment that had cost him nothing, sitting 14 months in his east field, waiting for someone to decide what it was actually worth. He called his neighbor with a tractor and a chain, and they pulled the machine to his shop. Harold did not begin with optimism or with a plan. He began with an inspection, the methodical kind that requires no optimism and generates no plan until the inspection is complete. He went through the machine system by system over 3 days, documenting what he found in a spiral notebook on the shop workbench. The hydraulic pump was beyond rebuild, internal scoring too severe, clearances too far gone. The hydraulic system itself, lines and cylinders and valves, was intact and serviceable once the pump was replaced. The electrical fault was a corroded main harness connector behind the instrument panel, a repair requiring patience and a crimping tool, not a new harness. The cab moisture damage had reached the headliner and one door seal, but had not compromised the structural elements or the glass. The engine, which he pulled the valve cover on to examine, was cleaner than he had any right to expect. The previous owner, whatever his faults and disclosure, had kept the engine serviced. Harold sat with his notebook that evening and added up what he was looking at. The hydraulic pump was the critical cost. He called a supplier in Indianapolis he had used for Case IH parts, described the application, and was quoted $840 for a rebuilt unit. He called 2 more suppliers. The range was $650 to $2,100. The electrical repair was his own labor and $40 in materials. The cab work was foam seal and time. The tire was $380 mounted. He ordered the pump from the Indianapolis supplier on a Thursday. It arrived the following Tuesday. He had the old pump off and the new one mounted and bled by Thursday afternoon. He started the engine Friday morning. The hydraulics came up correctly. He drove the machine out of the shop, engaged the rear linkage, watched it rise and lower cleanly. Then he drove it back into the shop and sat in the cab with the engine running, and thought about what he was going to do with a fully operational Massey Ferguson 6S165 that had cost him $2,280 in parts and 3 weeks of his own time. He had not advertised the machine's presence on his property. He had not told anyone outside his family that the title had transferred. But in Fountain County, information about equipment moves through the agricultural community, the way water moves through tile drainage, without announcement, through channels below the visible surface, arriving at its destination without anyone being able to say exactly how it got there. 3 farmers called Harold in the 2 weeks after he had the machine running, asking if it was for sale. He told all 3 he hadn't decided yet. One of them, a farmer named Pete Sollers, who ran a mixed operation north of Attica, asked what Harold wanted for a hydraulic pump replacement on his own MF6S. The machine was showing early signs of pump failure, and Pete would rather pay Harold to source and install the replacement than deal with the dealer in Covington, who had quoted $3,200 for the pump and $600 for the installation with a 3-week parts wait. Harold told Pete to bring the machine over on Saturday. He sourced the pump from the same Indianapolis supplier at $650. He installed it in 4 hours. He charged Pete $650 part and $200 for the installation. Pete's alternative had been $3,800 in 3 weeks. Pete was back 6 weeks later with a different machine and a different problem. Harold did not plan to become a Massey Ferguson shop. He noticed that he was becoming one. The observation he made across that first spring and summer was the same one that anyone paying attention to the agricultural equipment service landscape in rural Indiana would have made, had they been positioned to see it clearly. The regional Massey Ferguson dealer was 40 miles from the center of his county. Its labor rate was $115 per hour. Its scheduling ran 4 to 6 weeks out for non-emergency work. The farmers in Harold's area who ran Massey Ferguson equipment, and there were more of them than he had realized, were making a calculation every time something needed attention. Drive 40 miles, wait 4 to 6 weeks, pay $115 an hour, or find another way. Harold was another way. He was 15 minutes from most of the farms that called him. He charged for parts at his cost plus a margin he considered fair, and for his time at a rate that was less than half the dealer's labor rate and more than he would have made doing nothing. The farmers were not getting a discount. They were getting a different service structure, faster, closer, more direct, from a man who would tell them plainly what was wrong and what it would cost and whether it was worth fixing. By the end of the first full year, Harold had worked on machines from 22 farms. He kept a notebook of every job, machine, problem, parts used, cost, time. Not for billing purposes, but for the reason he had always kept notebooks, because a man who doesn't record what he learns forgets more than he should. The learning was accumulating faster than he expected. Massey Ferguson's 6S hydraulic pumps failed in a pattern he began to recognize. Hours, symptoms, the way pressure would fluctuate before failure became complete. MF7S electrical faults had a recurring location in the cab wiring that appeared across different machines from a similar production window. Certain hydraulic cylinder seals across multiple MF models shared a part number the dealer cataloged under only one of them, meaning sourcing the seal for a model where it wasn't cataloged required knowing the cross-reference, which the dealer's counterstaff didn't always have, and Harold had written in his notebook after the 3rd time he'd worked it out himself. This kind of knowledge does not exist in a service manual. It exists in the accumulated observation of a man who has seen the same failure enough times to understand not just what failed, but why and when, and what the early signs were. Harold bought his first parts tractor in the 2nd year, an MF5S with a destroyed engine and a sound everything else, purchased at an estate auction for $800. He parked it along the back fence and began pulling usable components as he needed them. He cataloged every component before he began pulling. What was present, what condition it was in, what it would cost new through his supplier. So that when a farmer called with a need, Harold could tell him within a few minutes whether he had the part and what he was asking for it. The parts tractor concept worked better than Harold had anticipated, for a reason he should have expected but hadn't fully accounted for at the start. The components he pulled from a retired machine were not just cheaper than new parts. They were tested. A hydraulic cylinder from a machine that had run 8,000 hours without that cylinder failing was a cylinder that had already proven itself in field conditions. A PTO shaft from a parts tractor was a shaft with a documented service life behind it, not an unknown sitting in a warehouse. Harold began to communicate this to farmers in the specific, plain way he communicated everything, and the farmers understood it the way experienced men understand arguments that match what they already know from experience. A part that has run is different from a part that hasn't. Not always better, but different in ways that matter when you're making a calculation about what to spend and what risk to carry. He bought a second parts tractor at the end of that year, then a third. His son came to visit in the spring of the third year and walked through the shop and the lot and the back fence line where 3 partial machines stood in various stages of being consumed. He asked Harold what the operation was making. Harold showed him the notebook. The son sat at the workbench for 20 minutes going through the numbers. He said the operation had gotten beyond what a spiral notebook could optimally manage. Harold said he was running it the way it needed to be run. The son said that was not an answer to the question he had asked. Harold's son built him a simple spreadsheet on a laptop Harold already owned and didn't use much. Harold migrated the notebook records into it over 2 weeks. What the spreadsheet showed, laid flat and totaled for the first time, was that the operation had generated $94,000 in its second full year from parts sales and repair labor. Harold looked at the number for a long time. He had not been tracking it in a way that made the total visible. He had known the work was steady and that the individual transactions were fair. He had not known the aggregate. The third year came in at $121,000, the fourth at $156,000. Harold hired Jim Castor in the fourth year, 63 years old, recently laid off from a crop input supplier that had consolidated its regional staff, 30 years in agricultural supply and parts before the consolidation. Jim knew how to manage a parts inventory. He knew how to source components across multiple suppliers and find the price and availability combination that made the most sense for a specific situation. His knowledge complemented Harold's mechanical depth the way a good parts man complements a good mechanic. Not visible in the same way, not credited in the same way, but the reason the operation worked as well as it did. Jim worked 4 days a week. Harold paid him fairly. Jim told Harold 3 months in that he had not expected to enjoy working again after the layoff. Harold took that as the kind of compliment that means more than a formal performance review. The regional Massey Ferguson dealer, now under its third ownership in 6 years, became aware of Harold's operation in the 5th year through a customer who had mentioned Harold's name during a dealer service visit. The dealer principal called Harold the following week. The conversation was careful on both sides. The dealer principal asked whether Harold would be interested in an authorized service arrangement. Harold asked what that would require. The dealer principal described the training requirements, the tooling requirements, the parts procurement requirements, and the pricing structure an authorized independent shop would operate under. Harold listened to all of it. Then he said no. He said it without hostility. The pricing structure would require him to raise his labor rate to a level that eliminated the primary reason farmers drove past the authorized dealer to reach his shop. The parts procurement requirements would replace his supplier network with a single channel that would cost him more and limit his flexibility. The authorization would create obligations that would change what his operation was in ways that made it less useful to the people it currently served. The dealer principal said he understood. He asked whether the two operations could cooperate in specific situations without a formal arrangement. Harold referring customers for warranty work or major rebuilds beyond his shop's capacity, the dealer referring customers for older machine non-warranty work that the dealer's cost structure made uneconomical. Neither man committed to anything formal. Both men understood the conversation had been useful. What the dealer principal did not say, and what Harold understood without it being said, was that the conversation had happened because the dealer's Fountain County customer count had been declining for years in a way the ownership had finally looked at directly. Harold had not taken those customers. They had arrived at his lot because the service structure they needed did not exist at the dealer's price point. That was a market condition, not a competitive act. Harold had not advertised. He had not undercut the dealer's pricing in a way that required the dealer to respond. He had simply been available, competent, and honest about what things cost, in a location that was convenient, at a rate that made sense for the scale of farms that couldn't justify a $115 per hour labor rate on equipment that was already paid for. The dealer's authorization structure, its overhead, its manufacturer requirements, its staffing model, all of it had created a gap. Harold had filled the gap. The dealer calling to discuss cooperation was the dealer acknowledging the gap without acknowledging it directly, which Harold considered a reasonable approach from a man in a difficult position. By the end of the 6th year, Harold's operation had generated cumulative revenue of just over $400,000. The number was not a goal he had set. It was what the work had returned when the work was done honestly and the parts were priced fairly, and the farmers who needed a different option found their way to a lot in Fountain County, where a retired grain farmer had made a decision about a seized tractor that a dealer had decided wasn't worth the cost of recovery. The Massey Ferguson 6S165 that had started everything was still running, still in Harold's lot, still working his fence lines and his gravel and his 40 acres. The hours had crossed 10,000. Harold had rebuilt the injection pump in the 5th year, 4 days, $340 in parts, done methodically with the service manual open on the bench and his own notes beside it, from the injection pump rebuilds he had done on customer machines in the years since. The engine had not otherwise been opened. The hydraulic system he had repaired in the first week continued to function without issue. Farmers who came to the lot saw the machine working and asked about it. Harold told them the story without embellishment. The dealer had determined it was worthless. Harold had made a different determination. The difference between those two determinations had been $2,280 in parts and 3 weeks of his own time. The machine had been working for 6 years since then. The farmers who heard the story did not find it surprising. They had their own versions of it, machines written off by people who were calculating at dealer rates rather than at the rates available to a man with a heated shop and 40 years of mechanical knowledge and nothing more pressing to do. The notebooks filled the shelf above the workbench. 11 of them now, dense with the accumulated knowledge of a man who had spent more time inside Massey Ferguson equipment than he had ever expected to, and had come to understand it in the way you understand something that you have given serious and sustained attention without any expectation that it would matter beyond the immediate problem in front of you. It had mattered well beyond that. A machine that a dealer had decided was worthless had arrived at the edge of Harold's East Field because a hydraulic system had failed at an inconvenient location and nobody had been willing to spend the money to recover it. Harold had spent $2,280 to make it run. In doing that work, he had positioned himself, without design, without a plan, at the intersection of a knowledge gap and a service gap that existed across several counties of agricultural land in central Indiana. He had filled that gap the way water fills a low place, not by planning to go there, but because the conditions made it the natural direction. Out in the lot, in its usual spot, the Massey Ferguson 6S165 sat ready for whatever Harold needed it to do next. Engine original, hydraulic sound. A machine that had been decided worthless by people calculating at the wrong rates, and decided worth fixing by a man who knew the difference between what something costs to restore and what it is worth when it runs. The dealer had left it in the field because the math hadn't worked out. Harold had done different math. For 6 years, the machine had been proving him right.